They weren't inmates. That's what the paperwork said. They were patients, residents, people receiving care in one of Ontario's most celebrated psychiatric institutions, a place the government described, in its own literature, as a model of compassionate treatment. But every morning before breakfast, they went to work. They milked the cows, they harvested the crops, they ran the laundry, they built the fences, they maintained the grounds of the institution that held them. They were not paid. They could not quit. And the institution they were working for filed their labor under a single line in its annual report: occupational therapy. This is the story of Lakeshore Psychiatric Hospital and the farm that ran on captive labor for over 60 years. Lakeshore opened in 1890 on the shores of Lake Ontario in New Toronto. The location was deliberate: beautiful grounds, lake views, fresh air. The Victorian psychiatric establishment believed that environment was therapeutic, that removing the mentally ill from the chaos of the city and placing them in natural surroundings would, on its own, produce healing. What it also produced was land. Hundreds of acres of farmland attached to a captive workforce that cost the institution almost nothing to maintain. By 1910, the Lakeshore Farm was one of the most productive agricultural operations in Ontario. It supplied the institution's entire food budget. It generated surplus crops sold to outside markets. The patients who worked it received no wages, no compensation, no acknowledgement in any public record that they had contributed anything beyond being ill. But here's what nobody asked at the time, and what the official history of Lakeshore still hasn't fully answered. If the farm existed to treat patients, why did it need to turn a profit? The system worked like this: patients deemed high-functioning, patients who were physically capable of sustained labor, were assigned to work details. The farm, the kitchen, the laundry, the carpentry shop, the grounds crew, the assignments were not optional. Refusal to work was recorded as behavioral non-compliance, as a symptom of the patient's condition, not as a legitimate response to unpaid forced labor. Patients who worked were rewarded with small privileges, extra food, slightly better accommodation, marginally more freedom of movement within the institutional grounds. Patients who refused lost those privileges. This is not a complex system to understand. It is, stripped of its medical vocabulary, a straightforward coercive labor arrangement: work and be treated marginally better. Refuse and face consequences framed as therapeutic. The institution called it recovery. The patients had another name for it: stay with me. Because the next part is what the official record tried hardest to bury. The patients assigned to farm labor at Lakeshore were not, as a group, the institution's most severely ill residents. They were the ones who could work, who were physically capable, who had been stabilized enough, through medication, through the simple passage of time, that they could follow instructions and sustain physical effort across a full day. In other words, they were often the patients closest to recovery. And here is the structural cruelty at the center of this system. The patients most capable of being discharged, the patients who demonstrated, through their ability to work a full day without incident, that they might be ready to re-enter the world, were the patients the institution had the most operational incentive to keep. A recovered patient who left Lakeshore was a loss to the farm. A recovered patient who stayed was free labor. The discharge records from Lakeshore's farm era have been examined by historians. The pattern they show is not conclusive, but it is suggestive. Patients assigned to high-value farm work roles were discharged at lower rates than patients in equivalent clinical condition who were not assigned to those roles. The institution may not have been deliberately keeping recovered patients for their labor value, but it also was not asking itself whether that was what it was doing. In 1923, the Lakeshore Farm generated enough agricultural output to offset a significant portion of the institution's annual operating budget. The provincial government's own financial reports noted, with evident satisfaction, that patient labor was reducing the cost of institutional care. This was presented as a success, as evidence that the therapeutic model was working, that patients were recovering their capacity for productive activity. What it actually was a subsidy. The Ontario government was running a psychiatric institution partly on the unpaid labor of the people it was supposed to be treating, and it was reporting this arrangement in official documents as a therapeutic achievement. The language is worth reading carefully, because the language did something very specific. It converted exploitation into evidence of recovery. It made the extraction of unpaid labor from captive patients look like medicine. And as long as it looked like medicine, nobody had to ask whether it was wrong. The institutional records of Lakeshore are extensive. Case notes, admission registers, treatment logs, annual reports. What they contain very little of is the voices of the patients themselves. Patient testimony from the farm era exists primarily in two forms: letters, some of which were intercepted before they left the institution, some of which survived in family collections, and retrospective accounts, the testimony of former patients and their descendants, gathered decades after the fact by historians and journalists who finally started asking. What those accounts describe is consistent. The work was real work, hard work. Farm labor in Ontario winters, kitchen labor across 12-hour shifts, laundry work involving hundreds of pounds of wet linen per day. The therapeutic framing was not something most patients experienced as therapy. They experienced it as work, required work, work that benefited the institution and cost them their time, their energy, and in some documented cases their health. Injuries on the farm were common, and the medical response to patient injuries was not always equivalent to the response a paid worker in the same situation would have received. One former patient, interviewed in the 1980s, described being assigned to the farm detail within 2 weeks of admission. He worked the farm for 3 years. When he was finally discharged, he was given a certificate of good conduct. He was not given wages. He was not given any acknowledgement that he had produced value for the institution that held him. He was given a piece of paper that said he had behaved well. Lakeshore Psychiatric Hospital closed in 1979. The land, the farm, the grounds, the lakefront property was eventually redeveloped. The site is now home to Humber College's Lakeshore campus. Students walk the grounds where patients once harvested crops. The architecture of the original institution is preserved in several buildings still standing on campus. There is a heritage designation. There are information panels. There is an acknowledgement that the site has a history. The information panels describe Lakeshore as a significant institution in the history of Ontario psychiatry. They note the farm. They do not describe the labor system in any detail. They do not use the phrase unpaid forced labor. They do not name any of the patients who worked the farm. The institution's financial records, the ones that show how much the patient labor was worth to the provincial government's budget, are in the Ontario archives. They have been examined by researchers. They have not been examined by the people who wrote the heritage panels. This is not an accident. Heritage panels are written by institutions, and institutions write about themselves in the language that serves them best. Every morning, for over 60 years, patients at Lakeshore woke up and went to work. They did not choose the work. They could not refuse it without consequences. They were not paid for it. And when the institution finally closed, and the land was sold, and the campus was built, their contribution to the financial viability of that institution was recorded nowhere that anyone was expected to read. The farm is gone. The crops stopped being harvested decades ago. The cows are long gone. The patients who milked them are mostly dead. What remains is the record, the financial reports that show how much the labor was worth, the case files that show which patients were assigned to which work details, the discharge records that raise questions nobody has been willing to ask officially, and the heritage panels that describe a pioneering institution in Ontario psychiatry and say nothing about who built it, who maintained it, and who worked its fields without pay for 6 decades. Canada is very good at heritage. It is less good at honesty. This is dark Canada, where the farm gets examined and the patients who worked it finally get counted. Subscribe, because the records are in the archive, and we are not done reading them.